The quickest way to embarrass yourself is to mistake someone's uniform for their intelligence. On a rainy Thursday evening in Manhattan, every table inside Ashford House was occupied by people who measured success in stock prices, private jets, and invitation-only galas. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, while quiet piano music floated through conversations worth more than most neighborhoods. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with practiced grace, balancing a silver tray as though it weighed nothing at all. Her white blouse was perfectly pressed, her black apron neatly tied, and her calm blue eyes rarely lingered on anyone for more than a second. Most guests never remembered her face. She preferred it that way. She greeted every customer with the same gentle smile, regardless of whether they ordered a simple bowl of soup or $1,000 bottle of wine. To Claire, respect had never been something people earned through wealth. It was something they deserved until they proved otherwise. At precisely 7:15 p.m., the front doors opened, and the atmosphere shifted without anyone announcing it. Ethan Caldwell stepped inside, followed by 3 executives in tailored navy suits and 2 international investors whose arrival had been anticipated for weeks. Conversations softened. The restaurant manager hurried forward. Even the kitchen seemed to move faster. Ethan was 39, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America, known for acquiring struggling technology companies and rebuilding them into global giants. Newspapers admired his brilliance. Employees respected his discipline. Rivals feared his instincts. But those who served him often remembered something else entirely. He rarely looked at the people bringing his meals. Claire approached the table with menus resting neatly against one arm. "Good evening. Welcome to Ashford House. May I start everyone with sparkling or still water?" Ethan barely glanced up from the documents on his tablet. "Sparkling." His tone was flat. One of the investors smiled politely. Another continued reading messages on his phone. Claire noted every preference without writing anything down. "I'll be right back," she said softly. Minutes later, she returned carrying crystal glasses and imported mineral water. As she carefully placed the final glass beside Ethan, he reached toward the menu without lifting his eyes. "Explain the Latin phrase beneath the chef's special," he said casually. Claire leaned forward just enough to read it. She pronounced the phrase with quiet confidence. Though one vowel carried the faintest trace of a European accent, she had never completely lost. Ethan finally looked at her. A slow smile crossed his face, but it carried no warmth. "That's not how it's pronounced." Several people at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Claire remained still. "Thank you for pointing that out, sir," she replied. Ethan leaned back in his chair, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "You know, restaurants really should stop hiring illiterate people to explain menus they clearly can't read." The words drifted across the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Conversations faded. Silverware stopped clinking. A young busboy froze beside the service station. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of her tray for only the briefest moment before relaxing again. She neither blushed nor argued. Instead, she met Ethan's eyes with the same composed expression she had worn since the beginning of her shift. Then, almost gently, she asked, "Would you prefer that I answer you in English or in the language you're trying to impress your guests with?" For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while dozens of strangers waited to see what would happen next. Ethan Caldwell studied the waitress with quiet amusement, convinced she had just made the biggest mistake of her working life. His reputation alone had made executives apologize for far less. Across the table, one of the foreign investors slowly lowered his coffee cup, curiosity replacing discomfort. Claire Bennett remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her silver tray balanced effortlessly against one hip. She had learned years ago that silence often carried more weight than anger. The restaurant manager took one anxious step forward before stopping himself. Interrupting one of the city's most influential businessmen could cost the restaurant an important client. Interrupting Claire felt equally unnecessary because she did not look frightened. She looked patient. Ethan folded his hands together. "Go ahead," he said with a faint smile. "I would love to hear this." Claire nodded politely. "Certainly, sir." She turned toward the first international guest, an older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit with a small lapel pin from Germany. Without hesitation, she greeted him in flawless German, her pronunciation crisp and natural, asking whether he preferred sparkling water chilled or at room temperature, because she remembered that many European guests appreciated the distinction. The gentleman blinked once before answering with an unmistakable smile. They exchanged several effortless sentences. His expression brightened immediately. Claire thanked him and turned gracefully toward the elegant woman seated beside him. In perfect French, she apologized for the slight delay in service and recommended the evening's seafood special, carefully explaining the regional origin of every ingredient. The woman responded enthusiastically, surprised enough to laugh softly before complimenting Claire's accent. Ethan's smile faded by a fraction. Claire then shifted her attention to another guest from Italy. Her Italian flowed with the same calm rhythm, warm and expressive without sounding rehearsed. She answered a question about imported olive oil, mentioning the small coastal region where it had been produced. The guest looked genuinely impressed. A younger executive at the table quietly set down his fork. No one seemed interested in the menu anymore. Claire next faced an investor from Japan who had remained mostly silent since arriving. She bowed her head respectfully before greeting him in polished Japanese. The conversation lasted only half a minute, but it ended with the businessman smiling broadly for the first time that evening. Ethan noticed the subtle change around the table. His guests were no longer looking at him. They were watching the waitress. Finally, Claire turned toward the last visitor, a distinguished businessman from the Middle East. In elegant Arabic, she welcomed him to New York, expressed hope that his travels had been comfortable, and mentioned that the chef had prepared a dish inspired by traditional Levantine flavors after learning about the evening's reservation. The man's eyebrows rose in visible surprise. He answered immediately, speaking much faster than before. Claire listened without interrupting, then replied with equal ease. A warm laugh escaped him as he placed one hand over his heart in appreciation. The dining room had become astonishingly quiet. Even servers passing nearby slowed their pace without realizing it. Claire gently returned her attention to Ethan, her expression unchanged from the moment she first approached the table. "Would anyone care for a few more minutes to review the menu?" she asked evenly. "Or may I take your dinner orders now?" Claire wrote each order from memory with steady handwriting before collecting the leather menus one by one. There was no trace of triumph in her expression, no subtle smile celebrating what everyone else had just witnessed. She moved exactly as she had before the exchange, quietly attentive, almost invisible again. That unsettled Ethan far more than if she had challenged him. Most people who proved him wrong wanted recognition. Claire seemed interested only in making sure every guest felt welcome. As she disappeared toward the kitchen, conversation slowly returned to the dining room, but it no longer sounded the same. Several nearby diners glanced toward the service station, whispering to one another. The young busboy who had frozen moments earlier looked at Claire with unmistakable admiration. Even the restaurant manager released a careful breath, realizing the evening had not collapsed into the public confrontation he had feared. At Ethan's table, the silence lingered. The German investor folded his napkin neatly before speaking in English. "Your server is remarkable." Her German sounds as though she lived in Munich. Before Ethan could respond, the French guest smiled. "I would have guessed Paris." There was not a single awkward pause. The Italian businessman laughed softly. She even knew which province produces that olive oil. Most luxury restaurants do not train staff that well. The Japanese executive nodded with quiet approval. Her etiquette was precise, very respectful. Finally, the Arab investor rested his hands on the table and looked directly at Ethan. She did not simply speak Arabic. She understood the culture behind the words. That is much harder. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had spent years building companies by identifying talent within minutes. He prided himself on reading people faster than anyone in his industry. Yet the woman he had dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier had completely escaped his judgment. He replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for clues he should have noticed. Her confidence had never sounded rehearsed. Her pronunciation had never hesitated. Most impressive of all, she had never once tried to embarrass him after his remark. She had answered disrespect with professionalism. That combination was rare. Across the room, Claire thanked the head chef before helping another server organize several dinner plates leaving the kitchen. She greeted every coworker with the same quiet kindness, never mentioning what had just happened. One waitress leaned toward her with wide eyes, and whispered something that made Claire smile gently before shaking her head. Whatever praise had been offered, she dismissed it with graceful modesty. Ethan found himself watching her longer than he intended. She did not carry herself like someone trapped in the wrong career. She carried herself like someone who had chosen dignity over explanation. There was a difference. Just then, the restaurant's front entrance opened once again. 5 elegantly dressed visitors entered together, speaking rapidly among themselves as they approached the hostess stand. Their conversation shifted naturally between Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin before ending in English. The hostess's welcoming smile faded almost immediately. She looked toward the reservation list, then toward the dining room with growing uncertainty. One of the visitors unfolded a leather portfolio and asked a detailed question in Mandarin that none of the employees nearby appeared able to understand. The comfortable rhythm inside Ashford House began to tighten once again. Ethan noticed the hesitation before anyone else did. He slowly looked toward Claire, who had also heard the unfamiliar voices, though she continued polishing silverware as if she had not yet decided whether this moment belonged to her. The uncertainty at the hostess stand spread quietly through the restaurant like a ripple across still water. The 5 newly arrived guests remained courteous, but their expressions revealed growing concern as they exchanged quick remarks in Mandarin before switching effortlessly into Portuguese. The young hostess apologized with a nervous smile and searched desperately for someone who might understand. She looked toward the manager, who offered an equally helpless expression. Ashford House welcomed international visitors every week, yet this conversation was moving faster than anyone on staff could follow. One of the guests gently pointed toward a printed reservation confirmation on his phone, then asked another detailed question, this time mixing Mandarin with English business terminology that only increased the confusion. A line of waiting customers slowly formed behind them. The elegant atmosphere that the restaurant carefully protected every evening began to feel unexpectedly fragile. The manager stepped forward with an apologetic smile. Please give us just one moment. His words were polite, but the uncertainty in his voice was impossible to hide. Ethan watched the exchange from across the dining room without saying anything. He recognized one of the visitors immediately. Victor Leong, chairman of an international investment group that rarely accepted face-to-face meetings without months of planning. If this dinner went poorly, the story would travel quickly through business circles. Around the dining room, conversations faded once again as curious guests noticed the delay. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier light, while waiters stood waiting for instructions that never came. Claire finished arranging the polished silverware on a nearby station before quietly lifting her eyes toward the entrance. She did not rush forward. She did not assume anyone needed rescuing. Instead, she observed for several seconds, listening carefully to the rhythm of the conversation from across the room. Only after she understood the situation did she place the last fork in its proper position and walk calmly toward the hostess stand. Her footsteps were unhurried. Her expression remained peaceful. The manager noticed her approach and offered a weary smile. Claire, I am afraid we are having a little communication problem. She nodded once. May I try? There was no confidence meant to impress anyone. It sounded like the simple offer of someone volunteering to refill a water glass. The manager stepped aside immediately. Claire greeted the visitors first in English, then gently transitioned into fluent Mandarin. The effect was immediate. Every trace of concern disappeared from the guests' faces. Victor Leong answered with visible relief, speaking naturally as though he had finally found someone who understood every detail he had been trying to explain. Claire listened without interrupting. She clarified a reservation discrepancy, confirmed dietary preferences for 2 members of the group, explained the seating arrangement they had requested weeks earlier, and even apologized for the misunderstanding using the formal expressions expected in a professional setting. The chairman smiled warmly before thanking her with genuine appreciation. Several members of his group nodded in agreement. The tension dissolved almost instantly. Nearby diners resumed their conversations, unaware that the evening had quietly returned to normal. Ethan remained seated, but his attention never left Claire. He had expected another impressive display of language. What surprised him even more was everything beyond the words. She understood etiquette. She understood timing. She understood how to protect the dignity of complete strangers without drawing attention to herself. As Claire escorted the visitors toward their table, Victor Liang paused beside Ethan's group, recognizing one of the international investors. After exchanging brief greetings, he smiled and, still speaking in Mandarin, said something that caused every member of his delegation to laugh softly. Claire translated with quiet composure. Mr. Liang says that the finest international consultant in this restaurant appears to be wearing an apron instead of a tailored suit. Victor Liang's words lingered in the air long after Claire returned to her duties. She thanked him with a gracious nod, wished his delegation an enjoyable evening, and walked back toward the service station carrying an empty water pitcher as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Around her, the restaurant slowly found its rhythm again. Glasses were refilled. Plates arrived from the kitchen. Soft piano melodies floated above quiet conversations. Yet something invisible had changed. People who had overlooked the young waitress only minutes earlier now followed her movements with genuine curiosity. Ethan remained unusually silent. His associates had worked with him long enough to recognize that expression. Whenever he stopped talking, he was thinking. He watched Claire help an elderly couple choose dessert, patiently explaining the difference between two seasonal pastries without mentioning that she had just impressed executives from 4 continents. There was no performance in her kindness. She treated every table exactly the same. One of Ethan's investors leaned closer. "She has unusual discipline," he said quietly. "Most people would still be enjoying the attention." Ethan nodded almost absent-mindedly. "She is not interested in attention." The realization surprised him more than anything else that evening. Throughout his career, he had built companies around incentives. Recognition, promotions, bonuses, public praise. Most talented people responded to one of them. Claire appeared motivated by something entirely different. Before he could organize his thoughts, another unexpected moment unfolded. A middle-aged couple at a nearby table struggled to communicate with an elderly woman who had just entered the restaurant carrying a small travel bag. She looked confused, scanning every face with uncertain eyes. The hostess welcomed her politely, but the woman answered only in Spanish, speaking quickly enough that the conversation stalled almost immediately. Claire happened to pass by with fresh bread for another table. She heard only a few words before changing direction. "Good evening," she said warmly in fluent Spanish. The elderly woman's worried expression softened at once. They spoke for nearly a minute while Claire listened carefully, smiling with quiet reassurance. She gently explained that the woman's family had been delayed by heavy traffic and had already called the restaurant. Her table was waiting exactly as reserved. Relief filled the woman's face. She reached for Claire's hands with grateful affection before allowing another server to escort her to the dining room. Ethan noticed something else this time. Claire did not merely translate words. She translated comfort. Every language she spoke carried the same calm presence, as though the people standing before her mattered more than demonstrating what she knew. Victor Liang observed the exchange from across the room and smiled knowingly. "Languages are not dictionaries," he said in English after catching Ethan's attention. "They are trust. Your waitress understands that." Ethan looked toward Claire again as she quietly arranged fresh flowers that had shifted slightly on an empty table. There was elegance even in that small gesture. Nothing about her movements asked to be admired. They simply reflected years of careful habit. For the first time all evening, Ethan questioned his own first impression instead of hers. He had called her illiterate after hearing a single pronunciation. Now he wondered how many assumptions he had made throughout his life after hearing only the beginning of someone else's story. The answer unsettled him far more than any business negotiation ever had. Later that evening, as dinner service settled into a comfortable rhythm, Ethan found that every conversation at his table somehow returned to Claire. His guests praised the food, admired the restaurant, and discussed international markets, yet her quiet confidence remained the unspoken center of the evening. It was unusual. Billionaires were accustomed to being the most interesting people in every room. Tonight, Ethan was listening more than speaking. When Claire arrived to clear the appetizer plates, Ethan finally looked directly at her. "May I ask you something?" he said, his voice noticeably different from before. Claire nodded politely. "Of course, sir. How many languages do you actually speak?" She paused only long enough to stack the final plate neatly onto her tray. "5 fluently," she answered. "English, German, French, Italian, and Arabic. I also speak conversational Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, and Mandarin well enough to help guests feel comfortable. No pride colored her voice. She listed them the same way another server might describe the evening specials. Ethan frowned slightly. That is far beyond conversational. Claire smiled softly. Language is not measured by vocabulary alone. It is measured by whether another person feels understood. The sentence lingered over the table. Victor Liang slowly nodded in quiet agreement. Very true, he said. Ethan folded his hands together. Where did you learn all of them? Claire's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain sliding down the tall restaurant windows. For the first time that evening, something almost invisible crossed her face. Not sadness exactly, more like the memory of a place that no longer existed. By moving, she answered gently. My father worked on international engineering projects. We rarely stayed in one country for very long. Every new school meant another language. Every goodbye meant another beginning. One of the investors asked, That must have been exciting. Claire gave a thoughtful smile. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was lonely. When you leave before friendships become memories, you learn that listening is often more important than speaking. The table fell quiet again. Ethan noticed that she never described herself as gifted. She described herself as someone who had adapted. There was humility even inside her extraordinary story. Did you study languages in college? He asked. Claire nodded. Linguistics. Which university? She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Columbia. Ethan raised his eyebrows. One of his associates almost dropped his fork. Columbia University's linguistics program was among the most respected in the country. Then why are you working here? The question escaped before Ethan had time to soften it. Claire did not appear offended. She looked at the neatly arranged dining room for a moment before returning her attention to him. Life sometimes asks different questions than the ones we prepared to answer, she said quietly. Education teaches many things. Responsibility teaches the rest. Before anyone could ask another question, a bell rang softly from the kitchen, signaling that several entrees were ready to be served. Claire lifted her tray with practiced ease. Please excuse me, she said warmly. Your dinners are ready, and they deserve my full attention. She walked away with the same calm dignity she had carried all evening, leaving Ethan staring after her, realizing that for the second time that night, the most meaningful answer he had received was the one that revealed the least about her and the most about her character. The entrees arrived one after another with perfect timing. Claire served every plate with the same quiet precision that had defined her entire evening. She remembered every modification without checking a single note, placing each dish before the correct guest while briefly explaining its preparation in whichever language made them feel most at ease. The German investor thanked her in his native language. She answered with a warm smile. The French executive complimented the chef. Claire translated the message before disappearing into the kitchen for only a moment and returning with the chef's personal gratitude. Nothing she did felt theatrical. Every gesture was thoughtful, measured, and sincere. Ethan watched each interaction more carefully than he watched the financial projections waiting on his tablet. For years he had believed that exceptional people naturally sought exceptional careers. Tonight that belief was quietly unraveling. During a brief pause between courses, Victor Liang set down his fork and looked toward Ethan with a thoughtful expression. Do you know why international negotiations fail? He asked. Ethan answered automatically. Poor preparation, weak strategy, conflicting interests. Victor smiled gently. Those matter, but the real reason is usually simpler. Someone stops listening before the other person finishes speaking. Ethan glanced toward Claire, who was helping an elderly couple fold leftovers into neatly packed containers while patiently explaining tomorrow's brunch schedule. Victor continued. Your waitress never interrupts. She waits until people feel heard. That is why everyone trusts her after only a few minutes. Ethan remained silent. He remembered every boardroom where he had dominated conversations, every negotiation where speed had been mistaken for wisdom. He had built an empire by making fast decisions. Yet tonight, the person earning the greatest respect inside the room was the one who spoke the least. As dessert menus arrived, Ethan noticed Claire quietly helping a new employee who appeared overwhelmed by the busy dining room. Instead of correcting him in front of guests, she stepped beside him, whispered a few encouraging words, and demonstrated how to balance 3 plates more comfortably on one arm. The young server smiled with visible relief. Claire returned to her section without waiting for thanks. Ethan found himself unexpectedly smiling. It was a small moment that most people would never notice. Somehow it impressed him as much as every language she had spoken. Extraordinary ability explained talent. Ordinary kindness revealed character. A few minutes later, Claire returned to Ethan's table carrying freshly brewed coffee. As she gently filled each porcelain cup, Ethan spoke before she could step away. "Miss Bennett." She looked up. "Yes, sir." There was no trace of resentment in her voice despite everything that had happened earlier. Ethan hesitated for the first time in longer than he could remember. He had negotiated multi-billion-dollar acquisitions without uncertainty, yet finding the right words now felt unexpectedly difficult. Finally, he asked quietly, "Have people underestimated you often?" Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes." She set the coffee pot carefully onto the serving tray. "But that has never been the real problem." Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. Claire's gentle smile returned, calm and unshaken. "The real problem is that many people underestimate themselves after hearing someone else's opinion for too long. I decided years ago that I would not do that." Her words were neither defensive nor dramatic. They were spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made peace with her past. Ethan watched her walk away once again, realizing that the greatest lesson of the evening had never come from the 5 languages she spoke. It had come from the confidence she never needed to announce. By the time dessert was served, the rain outside had softened into a gentle mist that blurred the lights of Fifth Avenue. Inside Ashford House, the evening had settled into an atmosphere that felt less like a business dinner and more like an unexpected lesson shared among strangers. Contracts rested unopened beside coffee cups. Expensive watches no longer demanded impatient glances. Even Ethan's phone, which rarely remained untouched for more than a few minutes, lay forgotten beside his plate. Claire moved through the dining room, collecting empty dishes with the same calm rhythm that had carried her from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her suggested she believed she had accomplished anything unusual. She thanked the kitchen staff for every completed order, smiled warmly at each guest, and quietly straightened a slightly crooked painting near the hallway as she passed. It was a small gesture that almost no one noticed. Ethan did. He was beginning to understand that excellence, for Claire, was never reserved for extraordinary moments. It appeared in ordinary ones as well. Victor Leong closed the leather folder containing the final investment documents and extended his hand across the table to Ethan. "I believe we have an agreement," he said with genuine satisfaction. Ethan shook his hand firmly. Months of negotiations had finally reached their conclusion, yet everyone at the table understood that the evening could easily have taken a different direction. As signatures were exchanged, Victor looked around the dining room before turning back toward Ethan with a thoughtful smile. "There is something I would like included in my memory of tonight," he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Victor glanced toward Claire, who was helping another server carry dessert plates toward a family celebrating a birthday. "The smartest person in this restaurant never sat at this table." Silence followed his words. No one rushed to disagree. The German investor nodded first. The French executive smiled quietly. Even the Japanese businessman lowered his head in respectful agreement. Ethan slowly turned toward Claire again. For the first time in many years, he realized that intelligence had nothing to do with who occupied the best seat in the room. Sometimes it was the person ensuring everyone else felt welcome enough to remain there. Ethan stood from his chair. Nearby conversations gradually faded as guests noticed the unexpected movement. He walked across the dining room, not with the confident stride that usually accompanied successful negotiations, but with the careful pace of someone choosing his next words with unusual care. Claire had just finished placing fresh coffee beside an elderly couple when she noticed him approaching. She turned with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. "Is everything satisfactory, sir?" she asked. Ethan took a slow breath. "Everything is." He paused, meeting her eyes without the distance that had defined their first conversation. "Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology." The surrounding tables grew remarkably quiet. Ethan did not seem to notice. "Earlier tonight, I judged your intelligence because of your uniform. I spoke without respect, and I was completely wrong." Claire listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to see him embarrassed before an audience. Only quiet attention. Ethan continued, his voice steady. You showed more professionalism in one evening than many executives demonstrate in an entire career. Thank you for treating my guests with dignity, even after I failed to offer you the same courtesy. Claire smiled gently, her eyes warm rather than triumphant. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Caldwell, she replied softly. A sincere apology always deserves respect because it takes courage to replace certainty with humility. Claire inclined her head with quiet gratitude, then returned to the table she had been serving before Ethan interrupted. There was no dramatic pause, no celebration, no attempt to prolong the moment. She simply picked up an empty dessert plate, refilled 2 coffee cups, and asked an elderly couple whether they would like a slice of pecan pie to take home. The rhythm of the restaurant resumed almost immediately. Conversations gradually returned. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light once again. Somewhere near the piano, gentle laughter floated across the dining room. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the exchange, the evening no longer felt ordinary. Ethan remained standing for a moment, watching Claire disappear into the familiar flow of service. He had expected that someone with her knowledge would be searching for a prestigious title, a corner office, or a position that impressed strangers. Instead, she seemed completely at peace doing honest work with extraordinary care. It was not the uniform that defined her. It was the dignity she brought into it every single day. Victor Leong stepped beside Ethan and smiled knowingly. Some people spend their lives learning new languages, he said quietly. Very few learn how to make every person they meet feel respected. Ethan nodded slowly. I thought I understood how to recognize talent. Victor glanced toward Claire, who was now patiently helping a little boy pronounce the name of a French dessert before encouraging him with an approving smile. Tonight you recognize something much more valuable than talent. Ethan followed his gaze. Character. Victor answered with a satisfied nod. Exactly. Nearly an hour later, the final guests began leaving Ashford House. Rain had stopped completely, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the city lights. Ethan walked toward the entrance with his associates before quietly stopping at the hostess stand. He removed a simple white business card from his wallet and wrote his personal phone number on the back. Instead of handing it directly to Claire with promises or expectations, he placed it inside a small envelope. On the front, he wrote only 4 words. If you ever choose. He gave the envelope to the restaurant manager with a polite request. Please give this to Miss Bennett after her shift. There is no obligation. No deadline. If she never calls, I will understand. The manager accepted it with a respectful smile. Ethan looked around the dining room one last time before stepping outside into the cool Manhattan night. The city appeared exactly as it always had. Towering buildings, endless traffic, bright lights stretching toward the horizon. Yet something inside him had changed. For years he had believed that success made people important. Tonight a waitress had reminded him that humility made people unforgettable. Long after the restaurant doors closed, Claire finished polishing the final wine glass and untied her black apron with the same quiet care she gave every task. The manager handed her the envelope. She read the short message, smiled gently, and slipped it into her bag without opening it further. Then she turned off the last dining room light and walked into the peaceful New York evening with unhurried steps, carrying nothing that announced her intelligence except the life she chose to live. Sometimes the loudest voice in a room belongs to the person who speaks the least. Sometimes the greatest education is learning to look beyond a name, a title, or a uniform. And sometimes the strongest language in the world is simple respect, because the people who never ask to be underestimated are often the very ones who quietly raise the standard for everyone else.